Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. Right after the 2016 election, the Nobel Prize-winning economist of the New York Times, Paul Krugman, weighed in. He said that the markets were going to collapse under Trump and never recover. But the stock market increased by almost 12% per year under President Trump, which was the best for any Republican president over the past century. Obama did a little bit better, but that was only because globalists crashed the economy ahead of the 2008 election in order to get Obama elected. And then globalists crashed the economy again ahead of the 2020 election in order to get rid of Donald Trump. And now the New York Times Nobel Laureate Paul Krugman has weighed in about climate. He said on July 4th, we're having a heat wave, a tropical heat wave, also a temperate heat wave and an Arctic heat wave with temperatures reaching the high 80s in northern Norway. The mega drought in the western United States has reduced Lake Mead to a small fraction of its former size. He blamed all of these things on climate change and the Republican majority on the Supreme Court. So let's take a look at what Krugman describes as being symptoms of the climate apocalypse. Temperatures reaching the high 80s in northern Norway. 100 years ago, during the summer of 1922, northern Norway was experiencing misplaced tropical heat, with temperatures ranging from 90 to 95 degrees. So northern Norway was quite a bit hotter 100 years ago than it is now. It's unfortunate that New York Times writers don't seem to actually read the New York Times. New York Times, June 17, 1937. Stephenson tells college class that society must unlearn fallacies about the North. Stephenson was the leading Arctic explorer of his time. He spoke of the great university of unlearning he had attended in the Arctic. 40 to 60% of what he had been taught about the Arctic was incorrect. Mr. Stephenson added that the United States Weather Bureau had published the fact that temperature went as high as 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade north of the Arctic Circle. In 1927, a group of motorists traveled to 270 miles north of the Arctic Circle and found that the temperature was never less than 90 degrees in the shade. And they had an actual race with death among the forest fires in Sweden over terrible roads. Also in 1927, the Perth Sunday Times published this picture of a child sunbathing near the North Pole. The NASA website has this nice chart showing how during the summer the Arctic receives more solar radiation than the tropics. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that the Arctic can get very hot around midsummer. Nobel Laureate Krugman got 3 strikes in the first sentence of his article, but I'm having fun, so I'll continue. In 1958, the New York Times again attempted to correct people's misunderstandings about the Arctic. On August 11, 1958, a U.S. submarine surfaced at the North Pole. The New York Times wrote about this. Some scientists estimate that the polar ice pack is 40% thinner and 12% less in area than it was a half-century ago. Within the lifetime of our children, the Arctic Ocean may open, enabling ships to sail over the North Pole. Although the idea that a solid ice sheet covers the central Arctic has lingered stubbornly in the popular fancy, the northern cap of ice worn by our planet is actually a thin crust, on the whole only about 7 feet thick. The Danish Meteorological Institute has been keeping temperature records at the North Pole ever since then. They show that the North Pole is having its coldest summer on record, with temperatures below the 1958 to 2002 mean every single day for the past 2 months. Stephenson also discussed this 100 years ago in 1922. He said that the ice between the North Pole and Alaska was young, thin, and rotten. Now let's look at Krugman's claim that they're having a tropical heat wave in New York. The temperature yesterday in New York City was 86 degrees Fahrenheit, which is just about average for this time of year, and the long-term forecast seems to be about the same. According to the Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine, the global temperature anomaly today is about 0.2 degrees Celsius above the 1979 to 2000 average. Krugman says we're having a climate apocalypse, but I think Earth can survive 0.2 degrees warming. If Krugman actually read the New York Times, he would have known that the hottest July 4th occurred more than 110 years ago in 1911, when people were dropping dead all over the country. The hottest July in the United States occurred in 1936. This was the front page of the New York Times on July 5, 1936. The farms of the Midwest were widely devastated by drought, and during the year 1935, 32,000 farmers moved to California to escape the heat and drought. Most of the people of our generation knew about the Dust Bowl years of the 1930s because they read about it in high school. John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath documented it in great detail. Perhaps the Nobel Laureate Krugman slept through his sophomore year in high school. This week in 1936 was the hottest week on record in the northern Great Plains. Dickinson, North Dakota got up to an incredible 121 degrees on July 6, 1936. Fort Yates, North Dakota wasn't quite that hot, but this week in 1936 they averaged 112 degrees and peaked at 119 degrees. If Paul Krugman read the New York Times, he would have known that drought ravaged Minnesota. He would have known that temperatures reached 119 degrees and that 200,000 families were in need of help from the drought. New York Times, July 8, 1936. Mercury hits 120 degrees. No rain in sight as crops burn in the drought area. New York Times, July 9, 1936. Heat kills 120 in nation. Increases crop losses. No relief in sight. Front page of the New York Times, July 10, 1936. Heat record shattered with 102 degrees here in New York City. Nation's death toll 245. The official temperature in New York's Central Park on July 9, 1936 was actually hotter. It got up to 106 degrees, by far the hottest day on record in New York. New York's Central Park has had 60 days over 100 degrees since the 1870s, all of which occurred at least 10 years ago. And the vast majority of their 100-degree days occurred more than 40 years ago. New York Times, July 11, 1936. 30 die here in 100-degree heat. No relief forecast. Western crops cut 40%. Cattlemen desperate in drought. 127 people died from the heat in New York City, 421 across the country. But Krugman says that this week's 80-degree weather in New York City is a tropical heat wave which proves we're having a climate apocalypse. During July of 1936, most of the United States was in drought. And July of 1934 was even worse, with severe drought from coast to coast. But Krugman says we're having a mega drought which proves the climate apocalypse. He cites the drying up of Lake Mead as evidence for his apocalypse. But if he actually read the New York Times, he would have known that mega droughts are the normal climate of California. In 1994, the New York Times explained how mega droughts in the 12th century caused lakes in California to dry up. And in 1994, the New York Times explained that the current problem with western lakes was people drawing water for irrigation. Perhaps 50 million people in California watering their lawns isn't such a good idea. The United States Geologic Survey shows that stream flow today in the southwestern United States is generally normal or above normal. The green dots show normal stream flow. The blue dots show much above normal stream flow. And the black dots show all-time record high stream flow for this day of year. Everything Krugman said was pretty ridiculous, but the funniest thing was his claim the Biden administration had the ability to control the climate. Biden has been in Washington for 50 years, and he's been in the White House for 10 of those 50 years. Dozens of climate agreements have been signed, and none of them have done anything to slow the growth of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's all just virtue signaling. Last year on September 21st, the New York Times reported China pledges to stop building coal-burning power plants. And at the same time they reported China hurries to burn more coal, putting climate goals at risk. And in April of this year, the New York Times reported China doubles down on coal. China's coal mining capacity grew more in the final 3 months of 2021 than all the coal produced in Western Europe. But Krugman says the growth of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is the fault of Republicans on the Supreme Court. 5 years ago, I testified before the Washington State Senate. The majority of my presentation was historical articles from the New York Times, and this is how the New York Times reported on my testimony. All they had to say about it was that I'm a climate denialist who says global warming is the biggest fraud in science history. I expected that they would be flattered by the fact that I used so much of their material in my presentation. The New York Times doesn't seem very interested in the historical record. George Orwell explained this in his novel 1984. Every record has been destroyed or falsified, every book rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every statue and every street building has been renamed. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always correct. Very few people have demonstrated their incompetence more than Nobel Laureate Paul Krugman at the New York Times. Toto has been calling out these Orwellian scamsters for the past 14 years. You can visit him, Kyrie Caesar, Upala, and Toki on the web at realclimatescience.com.